This image called Dreaming Accountability is from Mia Mingus's blog post in which she reflects on a rethinking of accountability. And Mia Mingus is a disability and restorative justice advocate. And I'm not going to share the entire blog post, but you can find it at this link that's below the image. And I wanted to put the image up here and really acknowledge Mingus's work because it not only informs the remarks I'm going to make here, but also deeply informs my rethinking of accountability in my own practice. So in the keynote, just to give you kind of an overview, I'll invite you to dig into your own conceptions of accountability at the beginning, because without sort of making explicit where you're starting, it's very difficult to do rethinking. And then I'm going to share some ideas and approaches with you that reflect my own rethinking of accountability and how that has changed my teaching practice, very specific examples of approaches that I use in my teaching that reflect this rethinking of accountability. Throughout, though, I'm going to ask you to be rethinking as you go, to take notes, to post in the chat if you're on Zoom, to turn and talk to somebody next to you if you're in the actual room. And we're going to draw on all of those for a fairly significant, at least 15 minutes, I hope, amount of time at the end to talk about what this kind of rethinking might mean, what questions you have, what reservations, what inspirations, that kind of everything that this makes you think about. So that's the plan for the keynote. So I want to start with standard notions of accountability. We all have assumptions about accountability. It's a word that's used very often in higher education and elsewhere. So I'm going to go back because you didn't have a chance to see the previous slide with Mia Mingus's of accountability from her blog post. So this here is her Dreaming Accountability blog post. And in it, she talks extensively about a rethinking of accountability in a way that's way beyond just higher education and teaching and learning, really keyed to her work in disability justice and restorative practices, but I have found it personally incredibly useful for thinking about teaching and learning. So I want to give you that image, and the link is here, and you can all have access to these slides after the keynote so that you can revisit all the resources that I've shared here. So let's start with surfacing some of the standard notions of accountability that people have, because as I said before, we all work within this notion or multiple notions really of accountability, and it's good to kind of dig down into what we mean by accountability. So if you're in the Zoom room, you can use the chat. If you're in the real room, what I would like you to do is to answer this first question only, okay? What do you think of when you hear the word accountability? And don't overthink it, don't analyze, don't worry, that you might say something that's problematic. Just turn to the person next to you and share some thoughts on what you think of when you hear the word accountability. And if you're on Zoom and you feel comfortable doing so, put some ideas into the chat. Associations with the term accountability. Let's take about 2 or 3 minutes. I see some notes in the chat. That's great. You can also respond to one another's thoughts. I can't hear what's going on in the room, but to just notice the kinds of things that people are saying. This isn't about judgment. It's just about noticing what people associate with accountability. So maybe take 1 more minute. Okay, now building on what you've just said and shared, move to the second question here. How do you conceptualize accountability in relation to your students, in relation to their work and your work with them? So draw on what you've just said, the definitions and associations and ideas you've just shared, and zoom in a little bit to think about how you conceptualize accountability in relation to your students. And again, put some thoughts in the chat, talk with people next to you, notice what people are saying. Okay, now take a minute, think about what you've heard from who you've been talking to, think about what's been posted in the chat, maybe read back over there. Notice any similarities and differences between your responses to the first question and your responses to the second question. Just jot some notes silently to yourself. We're going to circle back around to those, and I'm going to ask you to sort of keep those top of mind as we're moving through my remarks. But I'm just going to be silent for a minute and give you a chance to gather your thoughts. Okay, so in the chat, great comments in the chat. I'm seeing a lot about responsibility, a lot about communication, about explicitness, expectations, really about naming. And implicit here, I see what I often think of in terms of accountability in the sort of more typical way that we talk about it. And I'm going to focus on a single word here, which is holding students accountable, holding ourselves accountable. Faculty also labor under certain expectations about accountability. So everybody is working within accountability structures of various kinds. And I think we often employ the language of holding students accountable, in particular in relation to classrooms. And sometimes yes, and sometimes no, there's an implicit sense in that idea of holding, of a kind of a threat, a kind of, if you don't do this, bad things will happen. It's a sort of a sense of consequences if you don't meet the demands. And that is not a positive experience for most people. And so what I want us to think about together is this rethinking of accountability along the lines that Mia Mingus offers. Okay, and really she has a number of ideas that I associate with holding in a different way. And I'm going to read these to you in a minute, but just to think about this idea of holding. What if instead of holding students accountable, like holding them to towing the line, we thought about holding more like holding space for students to take agency and holding students as they take that agency. I saw some of that in the chat postings about a kind of a reciprocity in this idea of accountability. What if accountability were about making space for students to hold themselves accountable and to articulate what that means to them, not just how they're following other people's ideas, and to sort of bear witness and support one another as well as themselves in that kind of taking responsibility for their learning. So these ideas that I'm articulating here came from my reading of Mia Mingus's blog, Dreaming Accountability. And here are just a couple of short excerpts. It's not a terribly long blog, but this is just a couple that I'd like us to think about. What if accountability wasn't rooted in punishment, revenge, or superficiality, but rooted in our values, growth, transformation, healing, freedom, liberation? What if the work of accountability was held as so supremely sacred that people who got to practice it, truly practice it, were considered lucky, and those who had the honor of supporting it and witnessing it were also changed for the better from its power? So what I'd like you to take another silent minute and think about is, what assumptions would you need to revise in order to embrace this notion of accountability as rooted in these ways that Mia Mingus talks about, as more about holding students so that they can be responsible? That may be a long way from where you're thinking about accountability, or it might not be very far at all. So just take a minute, jot some notes to yourself silently about what assumptions would you need to revise in order to embrace this notion of accountability. If you're on Zoom, feel free to add to the chat or not, up to you. Okay, feel free to keep adding thoughts to that as I share the examples that I'm about to share. But I just want to acknowledge that this is about shifting mindset as well as practice. And again, that may be a big shift for some people, not such a big shift for others. And you may ultimately not want to make the shift, but it's an invitation, to think about it. So I'm going to give 3 examples from my own practice. They're listed here on this slide. I'm going to talk in detail through each of them. 3 examples of rethinking of accountability that I have done in my own courses. So the first is something I call accountability partners, which I'll talk about. The second is something I call the access need form. And the third is a co-created annotated bibliography that I use in one of my courses. So I'm going to move through each of these, and I'm also going to share with you for each example some student perspectives on how they experience this particular practice. So you get a sense not only of how I frame it and hope it is experienced by students, but also how they experience it themselves. So the first one is accountability partners. I call it accountability partners. Some of my colleagues at Bryn Mawr and Haverford call it learning partners. This emerged, just to give you a little bit of background, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we as residential liberal arts colleges had to suddenly move to all online teaching and learning. Students were isolated, and you all had a version of that yourselves. And students were really struggling with feeling connected in any way. So this idea of accountability partners is rooted in the values Mingus names: growth, transformation, healing, freedom. And the goal was to ensure that students had one other person, other than me, supporting their progress through the course. And I can't be there for everything that students need. They can be there for one another in a way that I can't. And so I think that's an important thing. This is, and I want to be clear that this is not about keeping tabs. This is not about sort of monitoring student progress, but rather about providing a structure within which students could become more aware and engaged and intentional and responsive to support and affirm one another's project and encourage accountability to the self and to the course in a way that was positive, not punitive. So that was the concept behind accountability partners, and you can read about it in detail in this article that's linked over here. But so here's how it works. So before the semester begins, or early in the semester, I pair enrolled students in the course and ask them to do the following, again, detailed on the here. So at the first class meeting, typically for me is on a Monday, which is Labor Day or Martin Luther King Jr. Day in our calendar. And so I send students these detailed instructions and ask them, instead of that first meeting, since we missed that class meeting, instead of trying to schedule a makeup meeting, I write to the students and ask them to meet in their accountability partner pairs. And so what I ask them to do in that initial meeting, and I give them very detailed guidelines, is introduce themselves or reconnect if they already know one another, which is sometimes the case. I ask them to identify supports and challenges that they experience in their learning that they anticipate with this course. So sort of develop a little metacognitive awareness there, thinking about what they might experience in this class, what they're bringing to the course. I ask them to read or reread and reflect on Mingus's Dreaming Accountability, again, linked here. And then I ask them to discuss the support structure of accountability partner. How are they going to use this? How could they imagine using it? Most of them, almost all of them, have never experienced anything like this before. And then they kind of conclude by doing a little reflection on this session. So what this does is really creates an immediate structure for them to be in contact. They may, this may be the first person they've met, in the course or at the college, if it's the first time there, and to really think through what kind of support they might need in the course. And what doing this signals to them instead of a first class is that this kind of accountability matters. This being present to one another matters. It's part of the course structure. It's in fact part of the course content, at this early. So it takes them a while to believe that and to lean into it. This is not something they immediately think, oh, accountability partners, sure, this is familiar and this makes a lot of sense to me. It takes them a while to not feel like it's punitive, to not feel like it's monitoring, to really kind of understand what the intention is. And then we carry this structure throughout the semester. So I give them time during class to meet with their accountability partners or text or whatever they use to communicate with one another during class as well. So the structure is sustained. And I give them prompts for that, such as, what do you feel good about accomplishing thus far in the course? And what's a goal for you have for yourself for the coming weeks? Or what approach did you take to completing this assignment? Where did you get stuck and what did you do? So the prompts I give them are also about process. They're about checking in with how people are doing. They're not about monitoring. I also have mid-course feedback sessions with accountability partners. So I meet with the pairs in the middle of the semester and ask them to reflect on the structure and also how they're using it. So they have a lot of scaffolding for using this particular structure. So just to link back to this idea of providing a thoughtful space and time for critical reflection, thoughtful engagement, positive kind of accountability, this is a space for holding students, linking back to Mia Mingus's idea, so they can take responsibility for their own learning. It's an opportunity to foster capacity in students to do that. So I want to give you a minute to sort of process this, what I've said, what I've shared about how it links to Mingus's idea, and give you a minute of silence to write to yourself, in what ways might offering a support structure such as this shift your own and student sense of accountability in a particular course that you teach? And just write to yourself for just a minute about that. Okay, so let me just share with you a few of the points that students have made about this experience. And I did see some questions in the chat that we'll want to come back to, like, what if your accountability partner isn't accountable and doesn't show up? And that can happen. So we'll circle back around to that. But here are just a few student points at this point. Accountability partners were a unique opportunity to engage with a peer about readings, experiences, and goals. We often neglect to put accountability and relationships at the forefront of education, but this class highlighted its importance. Accountability partnerships center around relationship building, which is necessary to feel comfortable in learning environments and also highlights the value of learning from others. In my partnership, I was able to learn not just about my partner's thoughts on readings and self-directed learning, but also about how their classes were going and other casual conversations that were influential in the success of our partnership. And then finally, the focus on accountability in the classroom highlighted the value of community of trust. My accountability partner was supportive and encouraged my half-formed thoughts, not making me feel insecure about my reflections. The partnership was influential, not just in one-on-one relationships, but also in cultivating a supportive atmosphere. I felt that I was able to share my ideas with other students, knowing that my voice would be appreciated. This learning environment not only made knowledge more accessible, but also highlighted the benefits mutual trust has in supporting students. So many other student comments like this that I could share, but I just want you to notice the language that students use here. It's not about being monitored and threatened in any way. It's surprising to them that it's not about that. It's about community, it's about relationship, it's about trust, it's about taking risks. It's about listening to and supporting one another as they move through the course, sometimes struggling, sometimes succeeding and celebrating, but it really creates a space and structure for a rethinking of accountability. And just quickly to address the question about what if students aren't accountable, because I dedicate time in class and because I ask them to do this work and it's apparent if they're not, over time, most of them develop a sense of responsibility and accountability. Some go deeper than others, of course. Some just do the minimum and just check in. But even if that's the case, I still think having the structure signals something quite powerful to students. So we can talk more about that at the end. But let me move to the second example that I want to share with you. So this is what I call the access needs form. And you can also read about this in detail in this article I wrote for Forum. So this is a kind of two different angles to foster a rethinking of the notion of accountability, both the individual and the community. And you saw that a little bit with the accountability partners. It's about those partners, but it's also about creating a classroom community that thinks about accountability in a different way. So in the article that I wrote about this, I note that connecting across differences is essential in every context, as Connor and Gillian remind us. And one such connecting, as White and Lawrence note, is increasing in higher education. Like higher education is expecting greater kind of connections like this in preparation for a world that expects being able to work across differences. So despite that, differences are typically, even the word has become a euphemism for deficits or for disabilities, which are often framed as deficits. And so part of what the purpose of this structure is to reframe those, changing differences from deficits into resources, to understand difference as a source of knowledge and understanding and growth and healing, for many people. Because difference is often cast either implicitly or explicit as a deviation from the norm, and languages that we use like remediation and accommodation have a tendency to that. So one of the things I'm trying to do with this is to raise awareness about that and to change mindsets and practices. So one of my favorite quotes around this kind of reframing is from Ray McDermott and Hervé Varenne, who wrote in 1995, "A disability may be a better display board for the weaknesses of a cultural system than it is an account of real persons." And so how can we form a kind of accountability that shapes both classroom environments and learning community, as well as individual growth that really supports understanding differences as resources? So that's the goal of the access needs form. So I give this to students early in the semester, sometimes before the semester begins, if I know who is enrolled already. And the form has these 4 questions. So it's an electronic form. And these are the 4 questions. So the first, please describe any differences or disabilities that you bring to this course. This does not replace the statement from Access Services that I have on my syllabus, but this is an opportunity for students to choose to share things that they think are relevant to their learning. So the second question, please describe the particular mode of access that would allow you to engage and participate fully in the course. So that's about offering support for what they need to engage. And then this third question, is about the reframing, and this is where students tend to get stuck and either say NA or, I can't imagine how this would be the case, but I asked them, please describe how your differences or disabilities can be a resource for you and others in the course. And when they don't answer this, I go back to them and say, please, fill this in. Please fill in something for every space here. And then I ask them if they would prefer to have this information kept to myself, so I just know this, shared with the class without their name, and shared with their name. So if that's the case, then they need to write their name because it's an anonymous form. Most of them choose the anonymous sharing. So that's how I first gather this information. And then I share it back with the class. I create a document that has what they have responded here, mostly without names, but with a fair amount of detail. And what I found in using this is that students, they don't link a particular experience to a particular person, which can lead to assumptions and stereotyping, but they know that there are people in this room that have the experiences that are described here. And so they are more thoughtful and intentional about creating a space that is supportive of these diverse experiences and ways of learning. It's amazing. And they've said as much. They say, I really am, I'm much more aware that I just have to be thinking about these things, not thinking about so-and-so that needs this particular thing, but thinking about this range of experiences that they have. So again, this is creating a kind of structure and practice for accountability, like Mingus talks about, holding space for other students to take agency and to be valued, for what they bring, and offering an opportunity for students to foster the capacity to articulate for themselves and to witness and support in others taking responsibility for learning. So let me ask you again to take a minute, respond to this prompt. In what ways might using a form such as this shift your own and students' sense of accountability in a course? And then I'm going to share some of what students write. So take a minute of silence and respond to that question. Okay, so let me just share a couple of excerpts from the kinds of things students write on these forms. So these are in the one student per box. So they have answered the questions of sort of what are some of the differences you bring and how might this be a resource is the ones that I've put in here for you. So one student wrote, I am bilingual and often find myself thinking in another language besides English. When this happens, I have trouble translating these thoughts into English, and thus there may be moments in class when I may have difficulty expressing myself in English. And then, my situation in particular sheds light on the monolingualism of academia. It would be great to talk about this as a class, while also thinking about the role that standard American English plays in our academic and social lives. So here you have something that might usually be framed as a problem, as a deficit. The student needs to, get their English up to standard, but rather than that, it becomes something that allows us to sort of think more critically about academia, about what is privileged and what isn't. And also sort of thinking about standard American English in academic and social spaces. This empowers this student to recognize a dimension of their identity that actually can benefit, both themselves and others in the class. So here's another example. I have social anxiety that sometimes prevents me from being present in class discussions, etc., because of personal fears stemming from years of depression. I can understand the needs of students, particularly students of color with disabilities, that don't receive the help they need because of conflicting parental beliefs, and bring my own story to what some students may need from their academic environment. So this is, again, about something that might be seen as a problem, something the student needs to deal with on their own to get into a space where they can be present in the class. But instead, the student sees this as a sort of potential empathy across differences, and also as a source of knowledge and understanding for supporting other students' stories in the course, how they navigate their own education. And then final example, my slow reading speed combined with my own perceived inability to accurately skim academic texts creates a need for me to spend much longer doing class readings than perhaps some of my classmates. My difference can help introduce me to types of readings and articles that are outside of the box and offer different ways of sharing knowledge. So again, not letting the norms and structures that are often imposed on students limit, what a learning experience might be. So recognizing a particular challenge as opening possibilities to other ways of engaging and being. So again, I've said a number of times now, this is really about reframing what's going on in our minds, teacher and students in classrooms, and then also what kinds of structures and spaces can support this very different kind of engagement. The ones I've offered you so far have been mostly about sort of classroom environment, creating a classroom environment, helping students reframe their own understandings of the way they're going to engage as individuals and with one another, which means they can be used across courses, adapted across courses. I want to share one now that's a little bit more content focused, and I recognize that this is going to be differently possible for different people depending on what kind of content you teach, what kind of course or lab you're working on. So my third example is what I call the co-created annotated bibliography. And typically, as we all know, we as faculty select the course texts, make up really most of the syllabus. The idea here is to share some of that responsibility with students, not all of it, but some of it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of how I do this. So in one of my courses each week, I have selected shared required reading. So everybody in the course needs to read one or two of these texts that I have selected. But also each week, each student selects their own reading and viewing or listening, whatever it happens to be. They select something either from their own areas of interest or from another course, which is a rare opportunity, to draw in something, say, from any other discipline, and they read it alone. They write a short annotation, so with a summary, a key quote, and the full bibliographic information so that other people can find it. They post this annotation to a co-created shared bibliography. So every week we have a whole collection of whatever every individual in that class wrote. And then they meet during class. When we do this each week, the class meets multiple times a week, so it only happens once a week, that we meet in small groups to share what they read or watched or listened to and connect it to course themes and the focus of the class session. So there's a lot of autonomy here, but there's a lot of responsibility to share with others, right, what they have explored, how it connects to the course. It helps them deepen their understanding of the course themes and goals, and it also gives them a chance to share what matters to them. Then finally, the last point here, some weeks, instead of contributing to the co-created annotated bibliography, I ask students to read across annotations for themes, because there's a lot of text that gets generated with every single week, more than 20 students, posting, and this is a lot. So I want to honor what they've been doing by giving them time to read across the annotations instead of reading new texts, identify themes, bring ideas to talk about in the small groups. So again, recognizing this might play out differently, might be challenging, more so in some courses than in others, I would invite you just to take a minute and think about around what content in your course might students co-create an annotated bibliography like this, and take some notes to yourself for a minute. And then again, I'll share some of what students have written. Think about a slice of content or thread that goes through one of your courses that students might co-create an annotated bibliography. Okay, so let me share just a few student reflections on their experiences of this co-created annotated bibliography. So one student wrote, "I didn't realize the importance of annotated bibliography until we read about culturally responsive classrooms and materials. I think the annotated bibliography is such a wonderful example of practicing culturally responsive pedagogy because it allows students to bring in topics that they're interested in and that they felt are relevant. The small group discussion further allowed us to bring these culturally responsive knowledge and materials from virtual space to classroom discussion." So another student wrote, "Before taking this course, my experience with annotated bibliographies was strictly a class assignment, a document that only a professor could access, attaching its worth to a grade. However, having co-created a classroom library of rich resources was beyond rewarding. I was very intentional about focusing on my raw personal reflections instead of feeling the pressure to follow a formula or produce deep analysis. The point was to share resources and provide an annotation where my classmates could get a feel for the topic and an insight into my thinking. Reading other people's findings was interesting and quickly solidified that while we all share one classroom space, we possess a wide range of interests to learn from. And then finally, the annotated bibliography is a great example of the conceptual shift away from competition and towards collaboration. In the first week, it didn't really cross my mind to read through other students' annotations. However, when we shared our insights from the bibliography during class, I began to understand the purpose of this assignment. Through this activity, I started to view my classmates as valuable resources for learning, growth, and co-creation. So just these are examples, of course, of people making the most of these. And so not everybody takes it up fully. Not everybody thinks it's such a fabulous idea. So I'm not saying these are silver bullets or any kind of, solving of the kinds of engagement challenges that we all face, or that they automatically create the kind of reimagined accountability that I'm talking about here. But I do think that they strive to create, again, structures and supports for students rethinking these things, like from competition towards collaboration, like culturally responsive practice, like leaning into something for the learning, not just for the grade. Those are the kinds of things we say we want students to do. But if we have practices that reinforce the things we don't want them to do, it's on us as well that they keep doing those things. So I want to move from these examples to some discussion. We have about almost a little more than 15 minutes for questions, discussion, answers, inspirations, concerns, worries. So what I'll ask you to do is look back through your notes at what you put in the chat, at what you wrote to yourself, at the kinds of things that I've been saying, and discuss these approaches, any questions or thoughts you have on them, ways in which they support a rethinking of accountability, and then also how you might adapt them and build on them and through this kind of rethinking. And to frame that discussion, I just want to share this slide. This is a student writing, "Learning is not always about comfort." And this was what I call a silent board discussion, where people put ideas up to gather a whole range of insights simultaneously and in silence about how to create more culturally responsive classrooms, to just give you a sense of the context of this slide. But I'll leave this slide up for a minute while you're gathering your thoughts, and then I'll stop sharing so that I can see more of you and we can have a discussion.
And while you're thinking, I'll bring a mic so that we can all hear if we have questions, and so that Dr. Sather can hear us as well.
Great, thank you.
You hear me?
For upper class,
No,
I think maybe.
Well, or just wait till
Go ahead. It should be on one.
Or I've got two questions.
Okay.
The first one is very specific. So thinking about differences in fields of study. So I am in the biology department and our content is really heavy. So how do you implement these practices without compromising your class content? I think that's something that I really I have a challenge balancing the two, trying to meet my expectations for the course, also implementing these things.
Widely shared challenge.
And then my second question is,
well, so I would say, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to answer the first one first, which is to say that I think the first two really don't take away from class content coverage. You can particularly key the accountability partners prompts, for instance, to course content. So you could ask them, so it becomes a kind of a review, which really contributes to student learning in the class, which might save you time later. So when I say I dedicate some time to students meeting in class, I'm talking about 5 minutes. It isn't 20 minutes or 30 minutes, it's 5 minutes where the accountability partners just meet, exchange ideas about something. So you could use that for a review. The prompt could be, what's a concept you're struggling with in this course, and what have you done to try to address that? So that one, I think, is fairly easy to integrate without sacrificing content. And I would say for the annotated bibliography, you could do it something along the lines of maybe a glossary, maybe key terms for the course, or key concepts, or key practices or approaches, whatever it is that students need to be learning. You can just use that structure to help them learn the content. So these don't need to be separate from the course content. You can use them to figure out how to support student learning of the content, but the structures themselves ask students to rethink how they engage. So that's what I would say in response to your first question. And so you have a second one?
Thank you. Thank you so much. The second one, in relation to the access needs forum. So sometimes, universities have the standard language that, you must include in the syllabus. So how do you go about influencing, especially like the wording where there's, they're already calling them accommodations and they expect you to add this specific phrase as it is. So I was just thinking, if somebody wanted to influence a change, for example, in that language, just like really just food for thought is probably, would it be maybe, I think as an individual, that would be a difficult thing. So I wonder if maybe group up as a department, agree on something, and then maybe present it to the university in terms of changing what's already in existence and has probably been there for a very long time.
Great point. And some of that language is due to legal expectations, requirements, constraints, necessities. And so it may not be possible to change a term like accommodation, for instance. And I've had conversations with our access services offices about this, but you don't need to change that language in the larger structure to have a more critical conversation about it within your own course. So I put that language that comes straight out of the out of the access services office on my syllabuses. That required language goes from the syllabus. But I say to students, important, for you to get access to the services that you need from the institution. This is a slightly different conversation. It's coming from a little bit of a different angle. Those two different angles and sets of approaches can coexist. Sometimes they're in tension with one another, but the point is to be cognizant of that and to talk about it and to help students find language that works for them, both to get the services that they need and the support that they need, and to feel a sense of agency in their own learning and education. So I would suggest sort of taking that up as a both, and I love the idea of a department working together, maybe coming up with your own language internally that you want to use to talk about the differences that students have as part of their identities and then experiences in terms of access. But you don't have to eliminate that deficit language to focus on strengths and capacities. And someone wrote in the chat, why don't we focus on strengths? And yes, absolutely. I think that's the way to go. And that's part of what the Access Needs Forum is trying to do.
We can take a question from chat next. We were asked, are there class sizes that work better or less well with the practices that you're talking about?
Well, I think you can adapt all of them to any class size. You want to use them in a way that doesn't create a huge amount of work for you. I mean, that's a danger of some of these practices, but think about, for instance, the accountability partners can actually make less work for you, because while you have to create the structure and support it throughout, the students support one another a lot more. I've often have accountability partners say, oh, I had a question about this, but I just contacted my accountability partner, so I didn't get the question. And then maybe I get a subsequent iteration of it. But I would just say, think about how to adapt these so that they work differently in classes with different numbers of students enrolled, and also with different course content. Thinking back to the first question about some of the STEM courses and the pressure, to cover a lot of content, that is more and less true across disciplines and across courses. So in a course where you feel less pressure to cover content, you might integrate these more explicitly and extensively into the discourse of the course, where you really talk about these structures as ways of rethinking engagement, whereas in courses where you have to cover a lot more content, you might offer them as support structures, but not spend as much time talking about them and processing what comes through them. So I think it's a matter of adapting, not that they work only in some contexts and not in others.
Could you comment on how much maybe you're intervening into that accountability partner process for students don't show up? Because I do a lot of team-based learning, and that's one of those challenges too, is you just
absolutely
how to deal with a bad team member, or even setting it up where it doesn't devolve into a competition comparison kind of situation either.
No, the framing is really important. And, once they read that Mia Mingus blog, it really kind of shakes up their world. They've never thought of accountability in that way either. And so there's that really big mindset shift, that has to happen. So that, and we return to it regularly. So part of my intervention is that regular returning to. I don't think it would be especially effective just to do that activity at the beginning and then do the class as usual. Then it would have just been an activity that isn't integrated, into the environment and the practice of the course. So my interventions are scaffolding it throughout the semester and asking students to repeatedly use the structure, in a variety of ways. Now, of course, sometimes students aren't in class, sometimes they aren't responsive. So often if, let's say I say, okay, take 5 minutes and meet with your accountability partner, some people's accountability partners aren't there, so they get together with the people who are there. They still have the structure and they still have the practice. And so what that actually does is to create even a more supportive community, because then they get to talk with different people in the class that they aren't usually with. And they might say, oh, my accountability partner and I were talking about this. And somebody else might say, oh, wow, that's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that. One of the things I've been doing is this, so you really can create, if you have the structure, you can then put them, sort of plug them in different ways as needed to deal with the absence, either literal or otherwise. But, I would still say it doesn't work 100%. Nothing does. And so this isn't a surefire way of making sure everybody feels supported. Sometimes, students will say, I checked in with my accountability partner a few times. It was okay, but, didn't really make that much of a difference. Most people take it up much, much more than that. But there are, some people who just don't. And that's okay. That's okay. They still know it's there. So it sends a strong signal about what matters in the course, whether or not they use it to its fullest potential.
I think we have time for at least one more question. Anyone else?
In regards to the accountability partners, if you already have groups within a class, do you think the accountability partners would work better to have someone within their group or outside of their group to be an accountability partner based on your experience?
I think outside, personally, because then you're just creating yet another structure for students to use and another way of connecting people in the course. Because I know what students say over and over is they don't know other students in the course. They don't, they wish they had more connections. One of the students who, I work in a bi-college program, so Bryn Mawr and Haverford College. And one of the Haverford students once said, I don't know anybody at Bryn Mawr. This was the only way that I got to know, somebody at Bryn Mawr. Now I feel like I can walk onto this campus and, feel like I belong here. It was really very powerful to hear that. And so I think the more structures that we have for connecting students in a course with other students in the course, the better. Oh, nice to see the room where everybody is. Thanks for sharing that.
Any other questions? Well, why don't you join me in thanking Dr. Cook-Sather for her great ideas today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. Thank you for, for having this conference where people have an opportunity to think about their teaching. It's really great, really inspiring to see. And feel free, if you have further questions about any of these practices, you can read the articles about them, but I'd also be happy to answer additional questions. So